What is up, y'all? Special edition of the Coast to Coast podcast coming at you right now. I am Joey Powell for Inside Carolina. We are brought to you by Johnny T-shirt and Congruity. With this special edition, we try to shake things up. We don't really like to just throw the term special around. We like to actually apply it properly and use the correct application. And so we're going to do things a little bit differently right now. Sherelle McMillan is here. Sean Moran is on assignment, but we've put somebody else in the hot seat tonight. Freeport's finest. You know him as at Freeport Kid on X, formerly known as Twitter. Adrian Atkinson is joining us. If you're an Inside Carolina subscriber, which I don't know how you would have found this show without being an IC subscriber, but you've likely been very entertained and intrigued with Adrian's top 100 list. And a statistician by nature, Adrian is really, really high level with that kind of thing. And I'm not going to speak for you, Sherelle, but I've been told, and my college transcripts would bear out that I don't math good. Well, Adrian actually put together the top 100 list for the second time of UNC's basketball players, and I think it's not only really cool water cooler talk. It has driven a lot of comments on Inside Carolina's message boards and just real good traffic on the site. But I thought, hey, let's talk about it. Let's bring it together and talk about Adrian's methodology. Here's some of the backstory, because if there's anything that Sherelle and I love, it's debate. We like to embrace debate. Sherelle and I specifically, we love to embrace debate, and this is a great chance to do that. Sherelle, how the heck are you?
I'm good. I have a confession to make. For
Fire away.
years, I have read Adrian's Twitter handle as Free Report Kid, not Freeport Kid. And so, like, I always wonder, like, what is the free report? Like, am I missing something? Have I not signed up somewhere? But it's
You should have been
Freeport.
paid for the report, man.
Yeah, my eyes just added an R and an E there. So it's good to know that it's Freeport Kid, not Free Report. So I learned something today.
Well, Adrian, I'm going to bring you in here. Man, I'll be honest. I am absolutely floored, not only at your command of statistics and your ability to apply math to come up with a really cool, robust list like this. But first things first, you're talking about the top 100 of one of the most well-known sports programs in the world, like of all history and the history of ever. Tell me what your methodology is on how you can quantify and kind of condense it to just a top 100, because that sounds to me like something that I would not even want any part of, because it would just be too hard to do.
Yeah, actually, I have an entire ACC database that goes back to 1980. Not just for Carolina, but for all the ACC schools. That basically I've calculated the wins over replacement player per 35 games, which is kind of the key metric I use. I don't rank based solely on that. I factor in intangibles and all kinds of stuff, but I do have a big kind of database with all the teams. So I just kind of taken that as a starting point. And I will add, it only goes back to 1980 because they didn't have complete data before then. There's not minutes played data, so you can't do per minute stuff, which is very important for efficiency reasons. They didn't have turnover data or steals and blocks before the mid 70s. So prior to 1980, it's more just using box score stats. So it's kind of like a hybrid of from 80 on, it's kind of using the numbers and some deeper stuff. Before then, it's a little more kind of eye test and just, what you read about these, like Billy Cunningham and, some of these older legends.
I think that's one of the beautiful things about the project is you're looking at, I think your cutoff was 1954, but you're literally looking at guys that cover all of UNC's championships, well, with the exception of the Helms Foundation, but all of UNC's NCAA championships. And you're kind of comparing eras versus each other, and current guys versus our grandfather's generation, and so on and so forth. And that's fascinating in and of itself to try to think about how the game has morphed in between different classes of players. But what's new from this group versus the last time you did this 2 years ago? I realize there are new players that can now be considered, but I want to ask you, what has changed from when you did this in 22?
Yeah, not much really, other than adding the new, Harrison Ingram made it in, Armando and RJ Davis made big jumps from 2 years. I did it 2 years ago in 2022 in the summer. Other than that, I mean, there are era adjustments in the methodology. So there are small tweaks. Like the last couple of years have been kind of historically weak, but not by Carolina standards, but by ACC standards. So that's like a small little, constant in the model. So when there's like a weak year this year, all the other years get like a small bump for being historically stronger. So little things like that. But otherwise, it's just kind of the same list. I don't make huge changes to it, except for adding the new players.
So when you say historically bad the last couple of years, I'm just curious. I know this isn't about a top 100, but like, how bad has the ACC been the last couple of years relative to the rest of its history?
I mean, relative to the heyday, like I said, from 1980 on is where I have the data from, and like from 1986 to kind of 1993, 1994 that's like I use, like, there wasn't Ken Palm back in those days, so I'm just use the percentage of teams that made the tournament from the ACC, the non-conference winning percentage, and then the NCAA tournament record. It's kind of like a proxy for strength of conference. So yeah, back compared to like the mid 80s and the early 90s, it's considerably weaker. And I think Ken Palm has kind of backed that up on, for his era, for like, ranking the ACC relative to the rest of the country. Although I know a lot of Carolina fans will say, if you just look at the NCAA tournament, we're as strong as ever. We're winning games in March, which is true. But I mean,
is that and I know I'm getting away from the line of questioning, but is that a valid argument where it's like throughout the regular season, because the ACC or UNC or whomever does well in the tournament, like how do you weigh those two things? Because the goal is to win the tournament.
Yeah, I mean, as a Carolina and ACC fan, I like to think, yes, it matters more. And I think in a model, I mean, you could, like, sometimes I double count, or like, you give more weight to the games in March. But I mean, I think, college seasons are so short as it is that if you're not taking into account the entire schedule. So, I mean, I think all the games matter, but yeah, the tournament games do matter more. And I try to account for that in the model.
Gotcha. All right. Well, getting back to the top 100, what player have you received the most hate mail about? Maybe not hate mail. But just
way to keep it positive, Sherrill.
Or just like, why do you have so and so number 76, or why do you have this player 65? Even though your methodology is spelled out on every article, every link, it's there. But who are people surprised by where they're at the most?
Yeah, I think Harrison Barnes is typically one. I have him pretty low. I think he's 90th or something this year. Maybe he's up in maybe 80. I forget exactly where. He's in the 80s. And yeah, the efficiency, my model was very kind of efficiency based, and it doesn't like the archetype of kind of volume score. Barnes did score a lot of points to Carolina, but he didn't do it especially efficiently. He wasn't a good passer in his Carolina day. His assist turnover ratios were pretty mediocre, or downright bad even for a wing. So he doesn't score very well. When you come up with the actual the wins above replacement, he doesn't do well on that. But people remember Barnes as as a freshman, especially. He made so many clutch shots, made the game winners, had a 40-point game in the ACC tournament. I mean, was the number one recruit. Has been in the NBA forever now. Played for a championship team in the NBA. He's a great player. I think he's a better NBA fit actually than he was at Carolina. Fit that was a team with Henson and Zeller. So I mean, there wasn't a lot of room in the paint for a slashing winged early attack, which hurt his efficiency numbers. But yeah, he's pretty low. I did give him a little intangible bump, but he's still kind of low just based on the actual metrics. And I think that's probably the one I get the most pushback on.
So, it's funny that you talk about Harrison Barnes immediately. You and I were sharing this a little bit off the air. I love the sidebar you did comparing Cam Johnson to Harrison Barnes. And for whatever reason, when I saw that Johnson was so much higher than Barnes was, it's one of those head scratchers. And I have a follow-up for this right after I mention this, but you just kind of laid it out a little bit that Cam Johnson's numbers, especially from an offensive efficiency standpoint, and the fact that his assist numbers were up, and he was just better. in nearly every category. And I know Sherelle said this on the show many times, but senior year 2019 Cam Johnson was an absolute heater. And I don't think people appreciate that as much until you dig into something like this. Because like you said, Barnes was the number one recruit, had all the clout, all the herald, and especially the fact that he was hit multiple game winners. But the Cam Johnson numbers just, I mean, they're not significantly better, but they're better than Barnes across the board. Adrian, I want to ask you, what's something when you did this, and again, you've done this multiple times. What's something when you go through this exercise and you trust the methodology, you lean on that. That's kind of what gives you the numbers and ranks them. What are some that you saw that maybe the methodology or the ranking model gives you X, but you feel like your eye test really told you something different? That had to happen for you a couple of times because you've watched a lot of ball.
Yeah, I mean Barnes is probably one where I give him a little bigger bump than the numbers would indicate. I guess Sam Perkins versus James Worthy. I do have Perkins higher, but based just on the numbers and the metrics, Perkins would be significantly higher than Worthy. Worthy might not even be in the top 20 without he gets the big intangible bump from me because, the big game James, he earned that nickname in March. And I mean, but if you watch those teams play, I mean, Perkins was never like the guy on those teams. It was Jordan in 83 and 84, and it was obviously Worthy in 81 and 82, and Al Wood in 81. So Perkins never really, I mean, he was always an All-American, great player, all ACC guy, but he never really was the go-to guy on his team. But if you look at just from a pure efficiency standpoint, his field goal percentage was always off the charts, great foul shooter, a lot of block shots, rebounds, the permanent efficiency. So, he grades out higher than Worthy, and eye test wise, you would say, I'll take Worthy as my star or my go-to guy.
Yeah, I'm also curious. I think, as you're getting down to the top 10, for everybody who read the whole thing, I think you can kind of start figuring out if you've been around Carolina basketball enough who the top 10 are going to be. And obviously, you start thinking, all right, Ford, Hansbrough, like that's kind of just where you're going to land. Is there somebody for you that you just think, gosh, this is probably the most unheralded person, and then they pop up on a list like this, that you feel like, man, I don't remember them that much because I had a couple of start looking at like the 50s of guys that I didn't remember being that strong, but their numbers bore it out and kind of was the inverse of the negative surprise. They were somebody that really shocked you that the model ranked them as high. Who was that for you?
Yeah, a lot of the 50s and 60s guys, like you're saying, like I wasn't alive back then, obviously. The games, there's not much televised footage back then. Like I'm saying, the model can't even do a great job of, the data is not very complete back then. So it's really just kind of word of mouth and, what you read in old, newspapers and magazines. And, so those guys, I have Bob Lewis pretty high.
Stone tablet writings. Yeah.
Yeah. So those guys are kind of, I mean, I don't even know. Like I said, I haven't watched them. I don't have a great way to actually quantify them with, they didn't have tracking cameras in the arenas back in 1957. So it's, you don't really have the granularity of data you have now. So those guys are pretty high in the list, but I'm kind of just spitballing a little bit, or I'm not really sure. You'd have to ask an older fan than me, whether they fit in. They're slotted incorrectly.
That's fair.
So obviously, RJ Davis coming to his 5th year, made a huge jump from your list a couple of years, into the list this year. What does he need to do? Like maybe not numbers wise, but what are you looking for him to jump into that top 15, top 10, all time Carolina players, or do you think it's even possible based upon your formula and your methodology?
Yeah, it's definitely possible. He'd need kind of that Hansbrough last year. Actually Hansbrough was better. He won Player of the Year as a junior, but then he came back as a senior and he got that team success. He got the national championship. So, I mean, I think that's kind of what RJ really needs. Well, I mean, he needs to repeat as maybe ACC Player of the Year, first team All-American. Maybe, like, I wouldn't even think you need a National Player of the Year to jump into the top 10. But he would need, I think, the postseason success or like a signature. And they had to run, obviously, in 22 to the championship game. But he struggled shooting-wise against Kansas in the final. You know, he wasn't good against Alabama last year in the loss. He's had some big games. You know, he had the game against Baylor when they upset the number 1 seed with, 30 points. So, I mean, he's got a March resume, but I think if he just does what he does last year and then the team has that March success with a couple of kind of signature RJ moments, I think that might be enough to vault him into the top 10, certainly the top 15, I would say.
Gotcha. Yeah, it's funny. I'm gonna butcher the stat, but we talked about it on Coast to Coast at some point, and this is more of a counting stat, but like he's really done some incredible things I don't think people realize in his career. Like I'm gonna butcher it. I'm gonna try to say it anyway. I'll go back and look it up and find it for podcast listeners. Okay, so mark it here. But he's like, I think there's 4 other players in Carolina history who have had a game where they scored 30 points in their career, a game in their career where they had 10 rebounds, and a game in their career where they had 10 assists. And I mean that's wild because again, we're talking Carolina basketball, and there have just been so many great players, and he's one of the very very few who have done it. So that leads me to the 5th year guys. So like, how much of a challenge is it for Baycott and the guys who ended up playing 5 years at UNC? How do you try to adjust for them and that extra um, the extra games I guess they get for a chance to win, because winning does matter, and uh, they also have a chance to be less efficient because they're playing more games. So like, how do you weight all that, I guess?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, obviously, back in the 60s and 70s, freshmen weren't eligible. So you had 3-year careers, but you didn't really hold it against, or I mean, like a 3-year career for, Billy Cunningham or someone versus like Carter or Jameson, who could have played 4 but left after their junior year. I kind of view it as like how like they played 100% of the seasons they could have, whereas like Jameson and Carter played 3 out of the 4. So Baycott played 5, but he played. I mean, he was able to play 5, and it's a little COVID exception. So, yeah, I don't really hold it against him. Or I mean, I think it's not really based on pure counting stats, but you do have. I mean, you have to. He does get rewarded in the sense that he did come back. He did have those, those 5th-year games that, he had a couple more signature moments, the Duke win. So, yeah, I would say it doesn't necessarily penalize or reward it, but it is something that, we've had 3-year, 4-year, and now a couple 5-year potentials for like the number of years you can play. So that's just something to keep in mind, I guess.
All right, so I need you to relax on this one because I'm gonna come at you a little bit. I'm gonna be guy from Twitter who is angry about your top 100 list because it's the most important thing on July 24th. It's really important and it's worthy of fighting over and getting upset and calling people names. How, or tell me why you're wrong that you have Raymond Felton number 30.
I knew this is where you were going, dude.
So just explain to me why you're wrong on that one, and I'll just hang up and listen.
Well, specifically in context, you have Felton at 30 and Ty Lawson at 11. Because I will tell you, peeling back Sherelle's RIP curtains a little bit, this is one of the hottest, most contested hills that Sherelle McMillan will die upon, is the Ty Lawson v. Raymond Felton argument. So, Adrian, your model has Lawson 11 and Felton at 30. Give Sherelle the reasoning behind it.
Yeah, no, I'm a Felton guy too. If I'm picking a team or like win one game, then it's gonna be tough to go against Ray. But like you guys know, it's an efficiency based model, and Felton, he did a lot of great things, but he didn't score especially efficiently. He was way more turnover prone than Lawson. If you look at Lawson's assist turnover, and just all the scoring efficiency metrics, the offensive ratings, like it's really no contest there. And even the defensive charting, which I don't explicitly include in my model, but I do have all that data. Felton is definitely a better defender, but it's not like there's not like that gulf like there is offensively. And they both played 3 years. They both had the championship. So I think it really just comes down to efficiency. Maybe if you're using a model that's looking more counting stats, because Felton did score. I think if you look at his just box score stats, he played more minutes than Lawson. I think he definitely had more assists. I think he scored more, per game over his career.
And
So,
Sherrill is like one statement away from going. He's one statement away from going full old man in the barbershop, like just.
Oh, when people get upset and all fact and logic and reason like go out the window, that's where I'm at. I'm like, oh, whatever, man. It's efficiency, sufficiency. Whatever. Like Raymond Felton. No, I mean, it makes sense. I get it. I will say, he was playing with other people who were very concerned about making sure they had a certain number of shots. So that was something that may have been working against him at times. Now it worked for him too, because he got a lot of assists to those people, because those people could score. But I take into account also the roster around and all those things. So anyway, I kid, because I am I guess do the kids still call them stands?
We can't on this show. We are of enough of an age where we can't on this show.
Okay, because I think it might be out, but I'm
the other one, and I think you might agree with me on this one. The other one I get a lot of heat for is I have Derek Phelps over Ed Cota.
Yeah.
Just because, Phelps is my guy, but he's got better. Phelps grades out better in my model. Again, for a lot of it is because how strong the ACC was during his 4 years. He gets kind of a strength of conference bump. But yeah, the defensive numbers give him big. But that's one, like, most Carolina fans are way higher on Cota than I am. I loved watching Cota play, but in terms of evaluating his total game, he's not quite I wouldn't put him in that very top echelon of Carolina point guards.
It's funny, we always talk recruiting on Coast to Coast, so I'm gonna just add a little recruiting story. I was at an event on Wednesday down in Rock Hill, and I was talking to the parent of a guard who's from kind of the tri-state area. And, I'm like, hey, I'm Sherrill, blah, blah, blah. And the first thing he said was like, Ed Cota, man, he could play. I played against him. He was like, people forget how good of a player he was. They were like, Vince Carter and Antoine Jameson were good, but they were really good because they played with Ed Cota. He's my guy. And they started talking about Carolina's New York point guards, and in which, it was like, oh, but before him, it was King and Derek. And, it just went on and on about all the New York, Carolina point guards. I'm a Phelps guy myself. I think during my formative years, he was like just a pillar of just solid, just always in the right place, always making the great defensive play. I tell everybody, not to sound like old man, but just go watch the last 5 minutes or last 5.5 minutes of the '93 championship game.
Yes, Michigan.
Derek Phelps, he literally did everything you can do on the court: layups, steals, rebounds, defense, like everything. To help UNC win the title. And to me, that's what I remember about Derek Phelps, is just he's such a all around player. And then he would lock anybody up on defense, obviously.
I'll posit one for you. This is, again, this totally nukes your model, Adrian, but I think it's absolute water cooler talk. The Big Three tournament's going on right now, or what is the basketball tournament is going on, but then the Big Three will be happening here shortly. I'd love to see a world where it's the guys are the same age against each other, of Cota, Carter, Jameson, v. Touche, Stackhouse, and Rasheed. And that, I feel like, is just that's the ultimate UNC 3-on-3 highlight, because I think Cota's love, and I am absolutely a Cota stan, to use your word from earlier, Sherrill. Ed Cota's number should be retired. But that Ed Cota highlight reel that is on YouTube that everybody's seen 1,000 times, I think that's what keeps him in kind of the front of everybody's mind. We're talking with Adrian Atkinson at Freeport Kid on X, formerly known as Twitter. He put together Inside Carolina's top 100 ranking of UNC's basketball players. And so we're talking with him tonight. Last question for you, Adrian. You did a poll too. How would that go versus, Sherrill's talked fondly about angry people online, but how did the poll go as far as what responses you were getting against what your methodology was spitting out? And what were your biggest discrepancies or biggest WTF moments when you were looking at that stuff?
Yeah, the biggest thing, and this isn't too surprising, we talked about it a little bit, the older players, like the Pete Brennans and guys like that, Doug Moe, were way farther down the list when we crowdsourced it, just because almost nobody has seen those guys play. You have to be like a pretty serious Carolina fan, I think, to even know all the ins and outs of like what their numbers were and what they were doing in big games.
Yeah.
But yeah, all the guys, just about every guy from the 50s and 60s, even Rosenbluth, I think, was sixth in the crowdsourced one. I had him number 3. So, and Charlie Scott was down a little. They were all down significantly from where I had them. So that was one thing. The fans, the Trails point, liked Raymond Felton way more than my list did. I think he was right around. He's maybe 11 or 12 in there right now, right around the top 10. Although Lawson, I think it might be Lawson 10 and Felton 11. They're both right there.
Even the people are against Sherelle. I love it.
Yeah, the fans like Coda a lot more. He's, I think, top 25 or maybe 26. He's right around the top 25. The fans like Barnes more. He's in the top 50. So kind of the things we talked about already. Kind of big names that, for one reason or another, don't look as good in the statistical model. The fans kind of gave them their bump, or like the eye test bump, which, I mean, I think I totally understood. I think there are a lot of, I think it's actually, the list turned out very well. And, there's a lot of really smart Carolina fans. And I think that list is actually pretty good representation of like how the fans view the best players in Carolina history.
For sure.
It was funny when I was doing it. There was I won't name his name, but there was one player against Michael Jordan. And I was like, I almost want to be funny and like mess this up and pick that player. I think I sent it to you, but I decided not to. I picked Michael Jordan. So a couple other questions for you. Was there a player who you expected, just based on your knowledge of Carolina basketball, to be in the top 100 that wasn't? Or is it kind of pretty much what you expected?
Yeah, there wasn't anything that was a huge surprise. I get the crowdsourced one had Jackie Manuel in the top 100, and I've got him, I think, in the top 125. And he's another guy. It's hard to quantify individual defense in any kind of statistical model. So he's probably, and like Leaky Black, he's not in the top 100 in my model. I think he was in the crowd one. So guys like that, where they've played on good, they've kind of locked down defenders, or guys with that defensive reputation, are probably, or maybe a little underrated in my model.
I was a Kevin Madden guy, so I would have put him somewhere around there, just because I like Kevin Madden. He had the stretch marks on his arm where he'd been lifting so many weights. It's like one of my first memories of Carolina basketball. Jeff Lebo, Kevin Madden. So I wanted to switch a little bit, since we do have you here and we don't get you often, from the top 100. Efficiency and analytics and all of that stuff is, I don't want to say taking over college basketball, but it's become such a prominent part of it that I think we, as a media, I guess I consider myself in the media, we're still learning kind of on the fly. What's in your mind like kind of the biggest misconception about efficiency stats and analytics and kind of all the stuff that you do that people just don't get right? Like, what is it that you want people to understand better about what the numbers mean, or what they represent?
Ooh, that's a good one. I mean, people really love single game plus minus. We're just looking at, there's the guy on the Carolina message board always posts the single game numbers, and they're interesting, and I do them myself, obviously. I've been keeping them ever since.
I'm sorry to step on you, but Andrew Platek was a plus minus darling in a handful of games. So do with that what you will. Please continue.
Yeah. But I guess that's kind of one thing is, I mean, maybe fans buy a little too much into that. Even like even a 40 game college season isn't really enough to get super meaningful, on court data, lineup data. But yeah, there's, I don't know. I think a lot of the stuff is still like a lot of the really interesting stuff is from the tracking data that's not really publicly available for the most part. So yeah, I don't know. I would say fans are definitely getting smarter and smarter about like using metrics and understanding them. But then there's kind of like a whole nother level that especially like NBA teams are using that is not really for public consumption yet. And
Yeah.
I mean, I don't really have access to it. I mean, I've seen some of the stuff, but so I guess there's kind of levels to it.
I mean, on this show, we typically talk about offensive efficiency. That's one of Sean's favorite stats. It's one of Sherelle and my favorite stats too. And I think that's probably a good entree for folks who want to kind of get a little more into analytics. Is kind of that points per 100. How would you say that's probably a good intro stat or a good analytics 100 type metric, or is there something else you feel like people could look at as they're watching this upcoming season that might actually help pull them into the mathematical side of things?
Yeah, just thinking about the game on a per possession basis is kind of like the fundamental, it's not really about, it can be a high scoring game, but it can be really up tempo and inefficient. And it can be low scoring, like UVA for years played really low scoring games, but they actually had a pretty efficient offense. It wasn't pretty to watch, but, so that's kind of the fundamental thing is like, let's watch the game on a possession basis and like, kind of throw out these counting stats or like consider them, but also look at the rate stats and like keep that kind of per possession framework.
Are there counting stats that you still look at, or are you just completely washed away from counting stats?
No, I mean, I'm old enough, I still like to consume like an old school box score, like just looking at the minutes played, the traditional box score stats. I still like to consume that. And, you can kind of glance at it. There's still interesting things. I mean, it's easy to tell from a traditional box score if a guy was efficient, if he had 35 points on like 13 field goal attempts or something. You don't really need an advanced stat to say, oh, that was a really efficient game. So, I mean, yeah, I think you get plenty out of just the box score stats. Even minutes played is like a sneaky, because it's giving you kind of like these implicit things like, the coach, like the numbers don't look great, but the coach has him out there for, 32 minutes a night. So he's doing something under the radar that maybe most fans aren't seeing, or maybe the coach, maybe there's some other reason, but just something as subtle or like simple as minutes played can be pretty revealing.
Well, and for everybody who wants to bury stats and say that, 95% of statistics are BS, I think that what Adrian's done here is given everybody a great way to use them as a jumping off point for conversation. So if you have not yet, check out the top 100 list that Adrian did. It's a really good read. He's broken them down into, counting backwards from tens. The only thing I can think of that's probably better than that for your summer while you're waiting for football to start back up is Johnny T-shirt. You might want to, speaking of tens, use your IC membership. You get 10% off your Johnny T-shirt purchase if you get that code from the message boards. We appreciate their sponsorship of this here show. Go see them, East Franklin Street in Chapel Hill. We love them. Adrian, appreciate you taking time for us, man. Thank you so much. Really enjoyed reading this. Can't wait to see what you do soon. And again, if anybody wants to follow him, he's a great follow on social media, especially during the season when you start seeing what numbers can look like during and after a ball game, where sometimes, maybe the tape lies, sometimes maybe the numbers lie, but either way, it's a great way to kind of take your conversation about ball to the next level. We appreciate Adrian making time for us here on the Coast to Coast podcast. Shout out to Congruity HR for sponsoring the show as well. We don't have a 2 cents because this is a special episode. We definitely want to make sure that we still give this some love. CongruityHR.com or CongruityHR/Tar Heels. Get your free business assessment. Shout out to Johnny T-shirt and Congruity for sponsoring, to John Siegley for producing, to Sherelle McMillan for helping me drive the train tonight, and for Adrian for bringing this content for us to talk about here in the middle of the summer. We appreciate you guys making us a part of your podcast rotation. We will talk to all of you sometime very soon on the next episode of the Coast to Coast podcast here on InsideCarolina.com.